This video is about solving absolute value equations. Before we start, let's think about what absolute value means. When we talked about absolute value, say of 4, we talked about the distance from 0 on the number line. If we put 4 on the number line, we know it's 4 units away from 0, and so we know the absolute value of 4 is 4. If we take -4 and look at it on the number line, it's also 4 units away from 0, so we know the absolute value of -4 is 4. Well, a lot of times people talk about just taking the sign away and just say it's a positive number. That's easy for us to think about, but mathematically, how can we take the sign away? How can we take a negative number and make it into a positive? Well, one of the ways to think about that is to take the opposite of the number. That's going to become important because if we look at the absolute value of A, how do we find the absolute value of A? We don't know what A is. So how do you tell somebody mathematically how to find its absolute value? Well, we're going to do that by thinking about what we just said. If we have a positive number, we know the answer is just a positive. But if we have a negative number, we talked about taking its opposite because the opposite of -4 is 4. So we can define the absolute value of A to be just A, just that quantity inside the absolute value, if A is greater than or equal to 0, a positive number or 0. But if A is a negative number, we want to take its opposite. So we talk about the opposite of A if that quantity inside the absolute value A is less than 0. We're going to use this to solve absolute value equations. So look at the absolute value equation, x minus 7 equals 2. That quantity inside the absolute value could be a positive number, or it could be a negative number. Using the definition we just talked about, if that quantity is a positive number, then we don't do anything to it. So we just leave it as x minus 7 is equal to 2. If, on the other hand, that quantity is a negative number, we took its opposite. So we would take the opposite of x minus 7 equals 2. Now notice that we've taken something we didn't know how to solve, absolute value, and we've changed it into two equations that we know how to solve. So we're going to solve those two equations. So now we have two numbers that presumably make that equation true. So we're going to make sure we check both of those values back in the original equation. So looking at the equation, which was the absolute value of x minus 7 equals 2, our two solutions are x equals 5 and x equals 9. If we substitute 9 in for x, we get a true sentence. This is when the quantity is positive. Now what happens if I substitute 5 in? Oh, I get an absolute value of -2. If you take the opposite of -2, you get 2. So this is a true sentence also. So both x equals 5 and x equals 9 makes this absolute value equation true. So what happens if the problem's a little more complex? Well, you can use exactly the same technique, but the problem is that when you get those negatives with the 3 times people get confused, and they don't know if it's 3 times the opposite of this stuff or if it's 3 subtract. So it's a little easier if you think about isolating the absolute value first. So we're going to do that. Now take your absolute value, which looks a lot like the last one we just did, split it into two equations and solve it. So we're going to split it into when that quantity is a positive number or when that quantity is a negative number. And then remember, it's very important that you go back to the original equation to check. Don't go back and check into the one that you simplified. If you made any mistakes when you simplified and isolated the absolute value, you're not going to catch it unless you check back into the original equation. Okay, so let's do a little bit of a recap. Remember to isolate the absolute value first. Split the absolute value into two different equations. One of your equations is split as a positive value because the quantity inside the absolute value could be positive, and one of your equations is split as the opposite because the quantity inside the absolute value could be negative. Finally, make sure you solve both equations for the variable and check your solutions in the original equation. Okay, that's it for now. We're going to have some problems for you to practice. Remember, if you have any questions, talk to a math teacher.